Nicole Hemmer, thanks for being here. Nicely done.
You began your discussion about conservatism from the war years, World War II, to the present. But how does conservatism change from before the New Deal till after the New Deal?
So there are strains of conservatism in the United States in the pre-New Deal era, particularly if you think about the 1920s and the Republican Party in the 1920s. It was an adamantly small government Republican Party. That's going to change in the 1940s and the 1950s, but there wasn't in the 1920s, though, this combination of conservative ideas that you would see after the war. So we're talking mostly in the 1920s about a libertarianism, right? This idea of small government. In the period in the 1940s and 1950s, you get something that scholars call fusionism, where you bring together libertarians who want small government and traditionalist conservatives who believe in a traditional moral order. And you bring those together, you bind them with conservative anti-communism. Both groups see communism as the greatest threat to their ideas, especially in the 1950s and the 1960s, and that brings together a different type of conservative movement in the 1950s.
You all both have powerful intellects, and I realize we're at a university where you probably could throw a lot of rocks and never hit a conservative, but at which point does the use of language like fringe, which could equally be used initially as a small movement in the beginning, at what point does the fringe, when it's approaching 50% of the U.S. population, become a normal event as opposed to a pejorative use of words? That's all I'm sort of wondering. I don't mean anything by the question politically. I just said you get way too smart to use words like that if you don't really mean them today. It may have started as a fringe, but what are we dealing with now?
Right. I would not describe conservatism today or any point after honestly, after 1964 as fringe. These activists really were operating on what we would call the fringes of mainstream politics because they didn't really have a place in either major party. They were seen as suspect by common consensus culture, and so they were operating on the fringe, and they understood that, and they were trying to find a way to demonstrate to media, to people in politics, that wait, these aren't fringe ideas, and something has gone terribly wrong if our ideas of patriotism and anti-communism and Christianity are now somehow scary fringe political beliefs. And so the fringe was how they were described. I think it's an accurate description of the smallness and the exclusion of their politics, but they very clearly have fought their way back in by 1964. You certainly couldn't call a group that has just nominated someone to a major party the fringe, and I think the same is true for our politics today. We would call today, I think, the alt-right a fringe group. It's incredibly small. It's seen as very much outside of the parameters of normal politics, but Trumpism, I think we have to say, is not fringe at all. I mean, they're a major party nominee. So I think that those words change over time, but they can be an accurate description not only of the size of a group, but also how it's positioned vis-a-vis the rest of the political sphere.
Yeah, and Fred, I think you get at a really important point of the lexicon of these things and how you, I know as a journalist, as a working journalist, we spend a lot of time on, and sometimes we spend a lot of time contemplating what are the right words to use and what word is freighted with what meaning. Even as we were putting together just the script for my intro this morning, when doing the sort of last-minute edits of it on the screen, I was wrestling with how many times could I say conservative media, because that's there's nothing negative, no suggestion, positive or negative. That's a clear label. But if you say right-wing media, well, that may be pejorative in the minds of some people. And so at one point we had 3 usages of conservative media in 2 sentences and stuck in right wing, and I said, no, we can't do that. So then it became right leaning, but that whole dance of what's the way to talk about these things without signaling some sort of a bias or being pejorative is actually a real thing. And similarly, to your broader point of when does something become so big that you can't act like it's any kind of a splinter, but it's actually a central thing. That's like when the Tea Party movement just burst out back in 2010, and I was at the Wall Street Journal then, and I think it's fair to say I was one of the very few national media people covering national politics at the time for a major organization everybody wanted to be completely dismissive. You know, this is just this thing that was, even the Wall Street Journal wanted to be dismissive of the Tea Party movement. This is just something that Fox News has created. It's a Roger Ailes production. You know, that was an active conversation in the newsroom of the Wall Street Journal. And I came along and said, no, it's not. This is a real thing. It's a legitimate expression of a very large number of American citizens, and something we have to cover seriously. And for a while, I was a pretty lonely voice on that. And look what happened, you know. So I was right. Take that.
But to piggyback for just a second off of that, that's now a challenge that I face writing about, because I mostly cover conservatism in the Republican Party, and you can't describe some of the politics today on the right as conservative. So how do you describe a site like Breitbart that openly declaims we are not right-wing? We are populist nationalists. Right. And so finding a language that both communicates something knowable to your readers, but doesn't fall into that trap of being pejorative, is a real challenge for journalists. And you can perhaps understand why sometimes we make mistakes.
And what do you call that place where Trump voters and Bernie Sanders voters meet? You know, which that's a part of the political circle. You know, where they come back together. What do you call them?
What does it say about the function of the parties when the Republicans have nominated a guy who's not a conservative, probably not even a Republican? The Democrats came pretty close to nominating someone who is not a Democrat. What's happening with the parties?
Well, I think we've seen a real weakening of the parties. I mean, parties used to serve functions of raising money and messaging on behalf of candidates, and I think that those have been offloaded onto other groups. Super PACs now do the fundraising. Conservative media, and to a certain extent left-leaning media, now provide the messaging. And parties have been reduced in many ways to serving simply as a brand or a tribal identity. And what we're seeing is the ways in which these brands are, to a certain extent, being emptied out of the traditional policies and ideas that animated them for so long, but also being emptied out of the organizational work that parties did for most of the 19th and 20th century. That was the thing that made parties so important and so powerful, was that they were the kingmakers. They could select candidates. That's been offloaded in the primaries, and they provided money and structure that now is being provided elsewhere. So there's not a lot left for parties to do other than to signal to voters a general idea of what this candidate might stand for. And even that, as you see with Trump and Sanders, it may not be how it's functioning anymore.
It's also fair to say that parties really function when they have power, and so if you get in, we're in this protracted period of nobody really having dominance, and so that structures fall apart. You know, like empires, you know, they fall apart. And if the alignment finally settles somehow, and there's, you know, some part of the spectrum that is dominant again, then probably, you know, parties are healthier in that environment, I think.
Jonathan Haidt, formerly of this university, has lamented out loud in his writings and his books about how it's almost impossible for people just to disagree politely, that we demonize the other side, and the left and the right are equally guilty of this. He's not saying one of us does it more than the other. We've had a brilliant analysis today of what is, but we haven't talked about what we can do about it. He said, as I recall, look for some common ground. For example, he found Republican evangelicals tend to be very strong on climate, and there would be a nice bridge between them and the left. Do you have any ideas of ways to get us talking to each other more humanely?
Well, I do think that it is a major problem, that inability to even see the other side as people who honestly believe the things that they say that they believe. I do think, there are so many opportunities for common ground. I mean, you mentioned conservative evangelicals. White evangelicals are pretty pro-immigration reform. So there certainly are places to build coalitions. What we've seen, at least in national politics, is that there are incentives for office holders not to compromise and not to negotiate. I think that individuals are better at talking to one another than maybe representatives are of reflecting that common ground. But yes, I think that people tend to cloister themselves off with people who are like-minded, and so don't see any need to create that common ground. And I don't know how you solve that problem, except that I think that, if I were going to take another stab at Doug's question, is this a call for action? The call for action would be, we need better civic education so that Americans know how to read media, how to find things that are true, and also how to understand people whose politics are different from theirs, what the value in finding common ground is.
We had, I'm sorry I keep adding on to these things, but I can't help it on this topic. We've got this wonderful program going at the Miller Center over this year called First Year. I'm sure you all heard, if you've been to any of these forums, any number of them, you've heard about that. But it's trying to identify the most urgent issues that will face the new president, whoever that is, and then bring together groups of scholars around those issues and make some nonpartisan recommendations, a lot of which has to do with, how do you talk about any important thing in a way that any next president could make use of it. That's a challenge right there. But Gary Gallagher, the great Civil War historian here, he wrote an essay for one of those, one of the first year things about the worst first year. I mean, that being Lincoln's. You can't have a worse first year than the country goes to war against itself. And so we did a forum program with him talking about that, which was great and fascinating because he's the most interesting guy on the planet. But in the back of my mind, I kept thinking, what possible relevance does Abraham Lincoln have to the next first year presidency? But at the end, I asked him a question. I said, so what's the one piece of wisdom that we could draw from 1860 that has relevance to the president? And he said, in 1860, the country had become this place where too many people assumed the beliefs and actions of their enemies, and believe that whatever I think the other side is going to do is what they're going to do, and I'm willing to act on what I have concocted in my mind. And it doesn't matter how many times they say, it doesn't matter if Abraham Lincoln says, I'm really not trying to get rid of slavery, I don't believe that. I'm going to act on my presumption. And that was, and I actually thought that may be the single wisest thing that we'll hear out of the whole first year program, is that if this inability to agree on the most basic facts, and we end up having arguments about things like during the Democratic Convention, tremendous amount of social media about whether there were any American flags in the convention. And there was all this stuff that went around that Hillary had banned American flags from the convention. I'm sitting there, one night, I'm seeing this on Facebook, and I look around and I count 120 American flags, and it's on TV, but somehow we've got to, we have to get back to that very basic thing of being able to agree on a simple fact.
I tell this story at the beginning of the book, but my dad was pretty conservative, and I grew up pretty conservative. And over time, our politics began to drift apart. But because he was my dad, and I loved and I respected him, that we could have these roiling political debates that really were debates and not fights, where it made it impossible to say, oh, you're acting in bad faith, or you believe odious things. It required me and him to sort of sit and listen to what the other person was really saying in a way that was open and was a good faith listening. And I don't know how you make people do that, but for me, that has been key to my scholarship, my journalism, is that sense of understanding, knowing that you can disagree and still respect the other person and still really hear them. I think that you're right, that the more of that we have, the healthier our politics will be.
Where's Walter Cronkite when we need him? We all used to listen to him and we believed him. And that world has gone. Part of the reason it's gone is because the social media has changed it so much. I mean, we're Facebooking live. Yikes.
You're Facebooking live right now.
Yikes.
The
the problem is that the world is changing, and for example, our parties are maybe 50 years behind the times. We still have parties that believe in power and believe in controlling everything, and the parties no longer do that. What we need is to move toward an issue-centered world rather than a party-centered world, and I think we're on our way. I think possibly Sanders and Trump are going to be doing that a little bit, but I think in the future what we're going to see is issues. And of course it would also help if the people in Washington could actually spend a little time together instead of constantly being on the phone trying to hike or hark money from their donors. So just a couple of things. I don't think we're living in the same world that we lived in even last year. And what we have to do is figure out what the world is going to be like 5 years from now.
Yeah, I mean, just on the Walter Cronkite point, I think two things. One, it's important to know that even in the 1960s, when Walter Cronkite was the most trusted man in America, that there were lots of people, including conservatives, including Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew, who did not agree with that assessment of Walter Cronkite. They saw him as fundamentally biased. So it wasn't necessarily an entirely shared belief, but that world comes crashing to a halt well before Facebook Live entered all of our lives. And you can see it in that moment during the Tet Offensive when Walter Cronkite is like, oh, wait, I guess the government we've been reporting on this entire time has been lying to us. And as you lose faith in government and you lose faith in the journalists who have been telling you, reporting back to you exactly what the government's been saying, and turns out they were wrong too, that loss of faith in those institutions, that precedes our social media environment. I just don't know, what role social media will or can play in rebuilding any sort of sense of trust in information and in journalists.
I was wondering if you find that whether or not direct mail pioneers like Richard Vigueri have any kind of a role in shaping this early conservative media environment.
Yeah, somebody like Richard Vigueri, got dinged a little bit about this in the Wall Street Journal article, but Richard Vigueri, in addition to being great at direct mail, is terrific at self-promotion. And certainly direct mail played a big role in taking these conservative supporters for Goldwater and sort of funneling them to the conservative movement in the wake of Goldwater. But when I was in the archives, what I saw predominantly, especially in 1965 in response to direct mail, was that conservative activists were opening their mailboxes and they were getting 17 appeals for money in a week. And it was driving them crazy. They were like, all of these organizations are like, I need money, I need money. And the guy's like, well, I need money. Like, I can't just give all of my money to every single plea that comes through the door. And so in a way, it kind of muddied the waters. And a little bit of the activism and the desire to support the conservative movement as it's going through this change in the 1960s. I mean, it certainly is important. And somebody like Richard Vigueri did a lot of work, both in sort of moving past the Goldwater moment, but also in the 1970s, building the new right, putting social issues front and center. I think we just don't want to overcredit Vigueri for something that was part of a bigger media environment, but also was part of some real grassroots activism. I mean, I mentioned Phyllis Schlafly, who died on Monday. She was driving a lot of that, not with direct mail, but with her own media activism and with her own grassroots activism. So it's a bigger constellation of forces.
Let's go to the lady on the front there, and then we'll go to the lady in the back. We'll try to circle back. Yeah.
In light of what you're saying and how hard I try to wade through all this, is it even possible to have a knowledgeable electorate?
I'm an optimist. I'm going to say yes, that it is possible. It just requires, I think, a different sort of regular education and civic education. We live in a vastly different information environment than we did 30 years ago. And I'm not sure that our educational training has kept up with that. It used to be that the thing that you were trained to do in school was to figure out how to navigate the library so that you could find information. Now, any information you want is at your fingertips. The problem is there's signal and there's noise. There's tons of information out there. Some of it's good, some of it's bad. And I don't think we've yet transitioned to teaching people about how to find good information and how to wade through what is reliable and what's not reliable. And so I do think that we're in this moment of disruption and change, and that's why it seems so, this is never going to get better. But I do think there are ways that we can train the next generation, not only to figure out how to navigate all of this excessive information or cluttered information environment, but also, I don't know, it sounds so old-fashioned to talk about civic education, but I do think it's something that is vitally necessary if we are going to have that informed public.
Thank you, and that addresses one of my concerns as a media psychologist of what is happening to the psychology of our nation and the polarization and where that's coming from, and it just seems to be intensifying at such an incredible rate. If you can give us some perspective on that. Sometimes I think it's because of the immigration issue and how that's polarized our nation, but I have a great concern about how we are going to manage the psychology of what's happening and what you might say about that.
You know, it's interesting, journalists, when they write about this intensifying polarization, they often talk about waiting for the fever to break, as though it's this irrational infection of the system that is just going to stop at some point. And that, I think, is both wishful thinking, but I think that it also potentially misdiagnoses the problem. I mean, this polarization is serving someone's ends, right? There are rational choices being made by politicians who understand the best way to drive out an electorate that's going to vote for them, and being made by media companies. Look, Fox News is not going to message the way that it does if it's not bringing in an audience. And we can debate whether or not that's healthy, this new political environment that we live in. But I think it's important to understand the sort of rational roots of it. As for how we fix all of that, or how we fix it psychologically, I think you would probably have better answers than I do. That's right.
I wanted to make a comment about civic education. I spent part of my summer, so much so that my friends wanted to avoid me, reading the book of Chernoff's on Hamilton. And I said to people everywhere, that book should be used for civic education in our public schools. It's a marvelous read, and the text of it, somehow for me, when I ended that, I was more hopeful about the world in which I live than I had been. And it's so complete, but I appreciate your comment about civic education. My question really is, and Doug, you maybe can remember better than I can, but there was, and I don't think it was the beginning of the Tea Party movement, but there was a movement that came out of started with a young graduate student at Emory University, and it was to recruit conservatives. It began by recruiting conservatives to go to Washington to take very basic jobs and begin to train people for more public service. I don't know how effective that movement was. Living on the East Coast, maybe I was more aware of it, but he somehow disappeared from the public leadership role within the Conservative Party, as I remember it. It was sometime between 2008, maybe in 2010. But I wondered if you have any comments about that movement and how effective it has been. I understand that it has been fairly effective. Whether it still remains so, I don't know.
So I'm not familiar with this particular story, but I can say that one of the really effective things that conservatives did in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s was they did exactly this. Human events was actually critically important for beginning to train activists. They had a journalism school in Washington, D.C. They had leadership academies. They had political action committees as early as the early 1960s, where they trained conservatives in the basics of activism, of electoral politics, of what you do when you govern, of how to be a journalist and a conservative at the same time. How do you cover stories? And so that sort of nuts and bolts training is something that conservatives, and particularly conservative media, have really excelled at, and I think it plays an important part in conservative political success.
And that's something that parties that are trying to build power back do and do well, and we've seen bad party work on in some respects too. But that reference to Hamilton is a perfect segue to the idea of another brilliant read available in the ante room for all of you.
It'll be as good as Hamilton.
And so let's say thanks to Nicole Hemmer and then let her get back there and sign some books. Thank you.